Welcome to the Signature Books podcast. I'm Devery Anderson, and I am marketing manager at Signature Books. Now, today, my guests are Barbara Jones-Brown and John Hatch, two of Signature's staff members. And today we're going to be discussing some of the titles that are forthcoming for 2023, the ones that have been, for the most part, edited or are being worked on as we speak. So I thought it'd be a great discussion because I know you, as faithful Signature Books readers and listeners to the podcast, you will want to know about these, and I think you'll be excited by them. So just to introduce the guest today, Barbara joined Signature Books last year, March 1st of 2022, as the company director. And if you tuned in to the last episode of the podcast, you will know that she is co-editor of a forthcoming book, co-editor with Richard Turley. The book coming out from Oxford Press is Vengeance is Mine, The Mountain Meadows Massacre and Its Aftermath. John has been with Signature Books for about 10, or a little over 10 years now, and he is the editor of the signature title Danish Apostle, The Diaries of Anton H. Lund, 1890 to 1921. And he's the author of the forthcoming book, What Do You Mean Murder? Clue and the Making of a Cult Classic. So with that, we're going to get started. All right, I'm excited to have you both here today because Signature has a lot of great stuff lined up for the rest of the year. And I think our readers and our listeners are going to want to know about it. And I think they'll be excited about it as well. So let's go ahead and get started. I've got a lot to talk about. Most of these books are forthcoming. Our latest release is just out, so stores don't really have it yet for the most part, I think, and so it's still kind of considered forthcoming, and that is a new biography by Dan Vogel, which is called Charisma Under Pressure, Joseph Smith, American Prophet, 1831 to 1839. And so, John, you spent the most time working on this book. And first of all, why is this book such an important milestone for Signature?
It completes a trilogy that Signature started years ago, and it's really exciting to have it done. The first volume was done by Richard Van Wagner, and that was Joseph Smith's years from his birth, 1805, to the publication of the Book of Mormon. And what the trilogy allows us to do is really dive deep and to really examine both the events in a narrative historical form, but also to step back. And I think that's what all of these authors do. Van Wagner does it, Dan Vogel does it in this second volume, and then Martha Bradley Evans did it in her third volume, Glorious in Persecution, about Joseph Smith's Nauvoo years. So Vogel's book covers the Kirtland and the Missouri era. And as I mentioned, he's able to step back and really look at the forest through the trees. So it's a long book. It's 1,000 pages. People will definitely get their money's worth being able to dive deep into this. But that's what I really think is valuable about this trilogy, is being able to have 3 books that really go into Smith's life in a way that no other books have. I mean, there's obviously some very good biographies of Joseph Smith that have been published over the last, century or more. But I think this is unique. And I think having all 3 really allows readers to understand Joseph Smith in a way that other biographies just don't have the ability to expand on.
Yeah, and Devery, could I jump in and say what we've observed from the marketing standpoint? I was really excited. We just barely started doing some social media posts. We haven't even really launched into our full marketing efforts yet, but already the second we just did a few social media posts, it climbed to number 9 in total sales on Amazon. So number 9 in Mormonism. And that's like extraordinary for a book that hasn't even been published yet. So I think it speaks to just how much interest people are going to have in this book, and how much interest people have in Dan Vogel, the biographer, as well.
Right. And it's exciting because, this book is the longest of the 3, but the 3 together have to be at least 2,000 pages or more on chronicling Joseph Smith's life. And so, as far as I know, it's the first time a multi-volume work has been done, certainly one of this length. And so people are going to like it. And if you're interested, obviously Joseph Smith's life is also going to, just the events of the history of the church will be touched upon, obviously, as well. And so you get a lot of detail on him and everything that unfolded in Mormonism at the time. So I'm really excited about it. And John, are there a few, because of the amount of detail in this book, are there a few events from Joseph Smith's life that you found shed new light, or that, or at least are the most significant that people, will want to read about in some detail?
Oh, sure. I think what Vogel does so well, and I'm just going to step back. I know that Signature published this. I work for Signature Books, so it might sound like I'm doing some marketing gimmick. I just don't know. I'm not good at containing my enthusiasm for Dan Vogel's work. I think he's really, really good, and I think he's done such a marvelous job with this book. And that's just me speaking. I really think he's done so well. And I think what's different about this book is, yeah, the length allows him to go into more detail, but it also allows him to expand on that. And so, for example, throughout the book, he will step back, and whereas most biographies rely on Mormon or LDS sources, or kind of LDS adjacent sources from people living at the time, Dan goes and finds other sources. And so when there's an occasion where there's a healing, for example, and we know that, Joseph Smith touched a woman's arm and healed it or something like that, Dan goes and finds these other sources of what outsiders were saying, and examines those as well, and allows us to see that there was a different perspective from other people who, either rejected Joseph Smith or didn't believe that he had healed someone. That happens throughout the book. I think my favorite thing that Dan does in the book that I think is so valuable is, again, I keep using this phrase, but he always steps back, and he examines the landscape from a modern perspective. And I definitely don't want to make that sound like he's being presentist, because he's not. What he's doing is he's using modern understandings of human nature and human behavior to look at what's going on and to offer an explanation. I think Dan really walks the knife's edge of avoiding cynicism, but also remaining questioning. And it allows him to look at things from a different angle. He seems, I think he avoids the trap of making Joseph Smith all or nothing. He's either a prophet or he's a fraud kind of dichotomy that we've seen in so many biographies over the years. Dan doesn't do any of that. He really just wants to understand Joseph Smith. He wants to understand the world he moved through. He wants to understand what drew Smith's followers to him. I mean, that's part of the title of the book, Charisma Under Pressure. He dives deep into a lot about charisma and why these people might have been drawn to Joseph Smith. And that sheds, I think, a lot of new light on what happened in Kirtland, especially, and also in Missouri.
John, Deborah, do you mind if I ask a question? Just
Sure.
something just popped into my mind listening to John speak. Dan Vogel lives in Ohio, and of course, he's writing about these Ohio years. And so I was just super curious to know, like, did his living in Ohio make it easier for him to access some of these records that maybe people have never heard about before in his research? Or did being able to visit the places he's writing about, I'm assuming frequently because he lives right there, did that
Mhm.
affect the book?
I think it helped him with some of those sources. I think we live in such an interesting era where so much has been digitized and so much is available. But I do think there are some newspaper sources in particular that Dan was able to utilize, that may or may not have been in other biographies. But yeah, he has quick access to this kind of stuff. He can go to Kirtland and check things out. Um, but the thing too about Dan is, I mean, I don't know, you're hard pressed to find too many people who know as much about these sources. I mean, he did early Mormon documents and has just been living and breathing these sources for 20, 30 years at this point, and he's so familiar with it all that it really does make an impact on the book.
All right. Well, thanks for that. And again, this completes a 3-volume set, and they're all 3 available from Signature. So hope to see people complete them and read them, because I think there's a lot there to learn.
Devery, will you mention the titles and the authors of the other 2?
Yes, Richard S. Van Wagner is the author of Natural Born Seer, which subtitled Joseph Smith, American Prophet, 1805 to 1830 or 31.
30.
The other 30, okay, because the second volume by Dan picks up an early 31, so figure there's probably no overlap in the calendar year. And then, of course, there's Dan's book. And then the third one was written by Marty Bradley Evans, which is called Glorious in Persecution, Joseph Smith, American Prophet, 1839 to 1844, which covers his years in Nauvoo. So 3 different authors, tons of detailed research. You will not find this type of detail in any other biographies. So I'm excited. I've been excited to see that middle volume come along for a long time. And so it's finally here. So and they've been in the works for a long time, so these weren't quickly done. They were very well researched. All right, Barbara, you have been working on the book on the September 6th. Title is going to be The September 6th and the Struggle for the Soul of Mormonism by Sara Patterson. And this is significant because this year is the 30th anniversary of the disciplinary action against these 6 prominent scholars back then. So 30 years, I can't believe it. I was an adult keeping an eye on this whole thing and staying attuned to the situation as it unfolded. Sad moment in history, but this book is more than just about the September 6th. So you want to just tell us about the book and its importance?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll back up a little bit and talk about where the origin or the idea for it came. That was when I was annotating D. Michael Quinn's memoir, Chosen Path, which I think we'll also be talking about today and which is also forthcoming this year. But I was annotating his memoir. And of course, Michael was one of the so-called September 6, one of 6 people who were disciplined by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in September of 1993. And so as I was reading his memoir and what he had to say about this event and the events surrounding it, all of a sudden it struck me, this was last year doing this, and it struck me, oh my goodness, next September is the 30-year anniversary of this. And like you, Devery, I was an adult when this happened, so it doesn't seem like it's history. Anything that happens in our lifetime, we don't think is history,
Exactly.
but then you realize actually, whoa, it is history. But I realized, wow, there are a lot of people, a lot of historians even, who have just kind of heard about this or maybe read an article here or there about this, but wouldn't remember it in their lifetime. And I thought this is a really significant era in the LDS Church's history, and a 30-year retrospective would be fantastic. So I asked Sara M. Patterson, who is a professor of history and religious studies at Hanover College in Indiana, if she would be interested in writing this retrospective for us. And I think Sara is the perfect person to do it because she is not LDS, so she doesn't have a dog in the fight, so to speak, but she writes about Mormon history and is very familiar with Mormon history. She was one of the contributors to our recently published anthology, DNA Mormon, Perspectives on the Life of Historian D. Michael Quinn. So she had studied Quinn's life a little bit, produced this article for that book. And she has written about other Mormon topics, book length studies, and she has served on the board of directors for the Mormon History Association. So she's very familiar with Mormon history, does a great job, is well respected for writing about Mormon history. But again, because she is not LDS, there's no dog in the fight. So I think she could write about it as dispassionately as anyone. So Sara is quickly writing this book. It's amazing what she's been able to do in 9 months. We want to publish it in September of 2023 or this year. And so she's closing in on that. But Sara and I talked about, there have been oral histories and things done on just those 6 folks who were disciplined, but really that's just an alliteration. September 6th just is catchy. People pick up on that, but actually there were people excommunicated for similar reasons before the September 6th and after the September 6th. So really this book is a retrospective on that era and what was going on with anti-intellectualism, anti-feminism, anti-homosexuality at that era, and then how it affected not only these 6, but people, others who were disciplined, and also what was going on in the minds of the church leaders as they were carrying out these things. So it's going to be a fantastic retrospective. I think people will really enjoy seeing it from a historian's point of view. I've been reading her early chapters, and it's fantastic. So I'm really excited about this book.
Can you give us any kind of hint as in the struggle for the soul of Mormonism? Have we come very far in the last 30 years? Would you say we have, or are we not where we? I mean, I'm sure we're not where we want to be, or where a lot of us want us to be. But do you feel that we've come a ways, or are we still kind of maintaining that 1993 mindset?
I think that era of just mass communication or mass excommunications and disciplinary actions kind of quieted for a while, but we see kind of a resurgence, and I think we can see patterns of similar anti-intellectualism, anti-feminism going on again today. So it's really interesting to see these patterns coming back, which again, I think that also makes this book very timely for people.
All right. Thanks for that. I'm excited about it, to read about a period of history that I lived through and kept up on at the time, and to be able to see how our perspective now, 30 years later, how we'll look at that is
from a scholar
too,
and from somebody who didn't remember it because she's not LDS, her perspective. And the thing that's been interesting, Devery, is to see how she just keeps nailing it. Even though she didn't live it, she's just looking at it from doing oral history interviews, studying the sources, but she keeps nailing it. So
I think she was a perfect one to write it. So great choice there, and that was meant to be, I think. So, all right, John, you're also working on a biography written by Ken Cannon about George Q. Cannon. And we're excited about this one. It'll be part of our Mormon Live series that we're doing. We've published, I think, 4 of those so far, and this will be the 5th one. It's going to come out soon, this summer. And you've had a chance to work on this. And George Q. Cannon, if I'm remembering correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, he served in, I think was it 3 first presidencies of the church?
Yeah, I believe that's right. He, hugely prominent figure, probably after Brigham Young, the public face of Mormonism especially after Young died in 1877. I would call Cannon the public face of Mormonism, more so than certainly John Taylor, even more so than Wilford Woodruff. He is the one that people would have recognized in 19th century America. He was very public, very visible, because he often lobbied Congress. He met with prominent people. He met Abraham Lincoln. He met other presidents and sat with them and talked to them as he lobbied for Utah statehood and lobbied against anti-polygamy legislation and that kind of thing. He is someone that would have been very, very visible to these people in 19th century America.
So his prominence within the church and his influence outside of the church was something that few have been able to, I think, mirror in their own lives. And so that's what makes him so important. He was also a publisher, right? Did he publish the Deseret News Press, or
published the Deseret News? He had he published the Juvenile Instructor, and so a lot of the Deseret News editorials that are so important to historians because they reflect the thinking of the church in the 19th century were written by George Q. Cannon. He was a prolific writer, and he also had his George Q. Cannon and Sons publishing company. And so they published they published a lot of the stuff that to this day, historians rely on in one way or another. as a secondary source. There's Orson F. Whitney's History of Utah, 4 volumes published by George Q. Cannon. So he did a lot of that kind of thing.
John, did he found Deseret Book as well, or am I misremembering that?
I believe he did, but it became Deseret Book after.
Okay.
So Cannon
I
and
don't.
Sons became Deseret Book.
There was Deseret. There was Deseret Press, and then Deseret Book. And that came later.
So there was a major biography of Cannon published back around 2000, around that period, by Davis Bitton, who's former assistant church historian. How does this one differ from that?
I think in a couple ways. This is being published for our Brief Mormon Live series. It's not as brief as the others because Cannon is such a massive figure. Ken's put more into this one in terms of just sheer page count, so that he can touch on all of these things in Cannon's life. And so, whereas these books tend to be about 100 pages, 120 pages to introduce readers to these figures, this one will be more like 200, 250 pages for people to really be able to understand Cannon. Bitton's book, apart from the fact that I'm not happy to announce that the year 2000 was 23 years ago, but it was, and it makes me feel old. So there's been a lot of research since then. And Cannon's been able to, Ken Cannon, that is, the author, has been able to harness a lot of that. But I also think Ken has done a really marvelous job in his balanced approach to Cannon. You could approach George Q. Cannon a lot of different ways. Certainly as the faithful LDS member of the First Presidency, you could also approach him as someone who bribed newspaper officials to give Mormons positive news coverage. Ken doesn't shy away from anything, but he's also it's a sympathetic biography. He wants to understand George Q. Cannon, and so he makes that his goal in the book, and I think he succeeds admirably. Whereas Davis Bitton's book, for all the great detail in there and everything, it was a much more faithful biography, and it shied away from a lot of the controversy around George Q. Cannon that Ken addresses head on in his book, without letting those controversies, override the other details of George Q. Cannon's life. So he gets into his family, he gets into his political work and his church work. He really touches on everything.
All right. Well, I'm excited for it. I've been hearing from others asking us, when's this coming out? When's it coming out? So I know a lot of people are excited about it too. So it's coming soon. And so readers will be happy about
I think
that.
Sorry, jumping into the conversation here, John, I think it's really interesting to hear that even though Ken Cannon is a direct descendant of George Q. Cannon, he isn't hagiographic at all. He does face these difficult issues or these not so flattering episodes head on, even though he's a descendant, more than Davis Bitton, who wasn't a descendant. That's really interesting to hear.
Yeah, he does. He handles everything. And to be able to do it all in 250 pages is really a remarkable feat, but he's managed to do that. I think in that sense, it's a really valuable biography for people to be able to learn about George Q. Cannon without having to, read 800 pages.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for that. That sheds some great light on that. And Barbara, you've been, as you mentioned earlier, working on Chosen Path, the memoir of D. Michael Quinn. Now, sadly, Mike Quinn is no longer with us, and so we're publishing this posthumously. And so publishing a book that way, how did this, with him being gone, how did that affect the editing process?
Yeah, I'll be honest. This is the first time I have ever worked with a deceased author, so to speak, in terms of writing, their memoir, or excuse me, publishing their memoir for someone who has passed away already. And so it's been really tricky. John and I have had a lot of discussions about the best way to treat this. And normally, if I were to be working with a living author who's writing their memoir or their biography, I could make suggestions like, what's the theme of this memoir? And does this thing that you wrote here support that theme, or does it become extraneous? What's the storyline and what's the story you want to tell, and then work with that theme. So because he's no longer with us, I can't do that. So it's been a challenge to stay true to Mike's words. All of the memoir will be his words. But in order to fill in these gaps, then what we've been doing is annotating the memoir. So just kind of with footnotes, filling in like some sources, additional sources people can go to, and just kind of explaining things that normally, again, I would have asked Mike to explain in the memoir itself if he was living. But since we can't do that, trying to treat that with footnotes. So that's been a challenge. It's been definitely a learning experience for me working with someone who's already passed away. That said, I think it is a beautifully expressive book in that we learn so much what it was like for D. Michael Quinn he was born in 1944, and so a different era, but what it was like for him to be a believing Latter-day Saint, closeted gay man, and what his life experience was like that, and being taught at the time that if he simply was faithful and active in the church, served a full-time mission, married in the temple, and had children, that the gay would go away. And then his process of discovering this is not going away, this is who I am, and then making changes to live more authentically. So you have that theme going on, as well as he's ahead of his time in terms of being an LDS historian, in that he is unflinchingly out there telling the truth about Mormon history and trying to bring the church in line with that, and saying, look, we've got to share the truth about our difficult historical issues now, because if we don't, people will find out about them anyway. And he's advocating for this in the 1970s and the 1980s. And of course, that is the direction that the church has gone now, with publishing its gospel topics essays on its website and so forth. So Quinn was advocating for things that he was disciplined for and ostracized for, but is what the church has now embraced. So there's those two themes going on that come out, in fascinating ways through this memoir, and I really think people are going to enjoy it.
I met him, I met him in 1990 at Sunstone, just briefly, but then I had him come speak at a study group in 1992 in Washington. And so from 92 on, I was friends with him. I'd see him often, and we'd always talk and correspond a little here and there. So I knew him for about 28 years, I guess. And he always came across to me as a very private person. He would talk about his history, his writings and research, but didn't really talk much about his own life. And so in a way, it surprises me that he did this memoir, but does he come across very open, or is he still guarded somewhat? Or do you see does he just let it all out?
Yeah, I think, and again, I think that's why this memoir is so important, because like you say, Devery, he was kind of an enigma in terms of what was going on inside his mind and his private life. And everyone I talked to about this memoir, they all say the same thing. Even one of his children, one of his daughters told me, yeah, Dad was always he always seemed to be somewhere else. And so, yes, Quinn does explain, I believe, in his memoir, why he was so private, why he was so non-emotive publicly. And he explains that he was repressing his true self as a gay man his whole life. So he just became very good at that. And so there's all kinds of really fascinating insights that come out throughout the memoir like that.
All right. And so that one is Chosen Path, a memoir by D. Michael Quinn. So we'll be seeing that in a few months as well. So excited about that. All right. And John, you've also worked on the diaries of James H. Martineau. And he he's one of these that wrote it. His writings are very important. It sheds so much light on things, but a lot of people don't know who he was. The name isn't super familiar to a lot of people. So do you want to just explain to us a little bit about who James H. Martineau was and when he lived, so we can kind of know the period he covers?
Sure. Yeah. Martineau is one of these fascinating LDS characters, right? I mean, we've spent time talking about Joseph Smith. I've mentioned Brigham Young. We've talked about George Q. Cannon. These are the names that come up so often. There's this just host of people like James H. Martineau who lived in the 19th century, were LDS. He was a prolific diarist, and we can learn so much from him and from people like him. These are the people that are really that made up what the LDS faith was, right? I mean, you have your leaders at the top, but without the followers, without the believers, there's no one for them to speak to when they go into the Bowery or the tabernacle. And address the saints. These are the saints. And Martineau was one of those people. He was a really fascinating guy. He was born in New York. His father was an engineer and an inventor, but Martineau got gold fever in 1850, 1849, 1850, with the discovery of gold, which, of course, again, Mormons were heavily involved with in California. And so Martineau traveled west and stopped in Salt Lake City, and he was baptized LDS in 1851. And from there, he lived the rest of his life as a surveyor and really a pathfinder. He visited, I think, every major LDS settlement in the American West, or almost everyone. First, he went to Parowan and helped found Parowan in 1851 after he was baptized, and was a big part of that. He went to Logan later. He ends up in Colonia Juarez. And all this time he's surveying, he's working, and he's keeping this meticulous diary about his life and his experiences. And this diary is so important to historians because of the information it gives and the light it sheds on all of these things, on these settlements and on what's happening in 19th century LDS history. And it goes a little bit into the 20th century. Martineau lived, I want to say, until I finished volume 1 and I'm not on volume 2 yet. This will be a 2-volume set of Martineau's diaries, and I want to say that he died, I think, in 1921. And so that gives you a sense of the time frame there. And he also worked on the railroad. He worked on the Union Pacific Railroad in 1868. So 1 year before the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, he's doing that work. And he keeps a really meticulous record of that work, of getting the Union Pacific Railroad into Utah, and the dangers and the trials with that and everything else.
Oh, wow. The time period is very significant. This is the Mormonism in transition period that Tom Alexander wrote about. So there's been an edition of these that was published in the past. So how does ours differ, and why is it important, I guess, that a new one come about?
Yeah, the Martineau family, they have a wonderful family foundation. They're really have done a marvelous job of keeping Martineau's memory alive, James Martineau's memory alive. They did an edition that was of all the diaries and everything. It was just the diaries. There wasn't much annotation. There wasn't much else added. This edition, done by Noel Carmack and Charles Hatch, is heavily annotated. There is so much detail included to really set the stage for these diaries in a way that I think is really valuable. They quote frequently from Martineau's letters back to his family and to friends, and also letters to church leaders on how surveying's going and that kind of thing. So they have annotated this in such a way that now anybody can pick it up and understand immediately the context of what's going on. And it's really a fascinating glimpse into the history of the American West and how it developed after 1850.
All right. Well, I think
I
yes,
think
Barbara.
also it's worth adding that people who want a searchable version will now be able to have that because they could purchase the ebook versions of these volumes as well. So for historians that want to be able to search certain things, it'll be really easy to do that now as well. And then also, Devery, could I jump in and just talk about how Martineau, John was talking about how it can help historians in various areas.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, for sure.
So just a snippet. John was mentioning how he lived in Parowan. Martineau was the adjutant in the militia to the Iron Militia commander named William Dame. He was also in Dame's High Council, and so William Dame was the head, the top leader who authorized the Mountain Meadows Massacre in 1857. Martineau observes that in his diary, and also observes all of the investigations that take place after, and shares his observations. He's convinced that Dame is innocent, even though he's not. But just those day-by-day interactions were really, really helpful. And so that's just one example. But I found that Martineau's journals are just invaluable for whatever aspect of 19th century Mormonism historians might want to, or anyone might want to look into.
And that's exciting too, because I wonder how many other gems are out there that from everyday Mormons, Latter-day Saints at the time, whose names we don't know, who didn't necessarily hold high position, who observe things and have a lot to say. So there's a lot more that needs to be published, I'm sure. And we're great at documentary history. So and so many of our documentary histories have won awards, and because we find the best ones and we do a great job on them, the authors do. And so this is exciting. I've always been a big fan of this type of thing, and the importance of these volumes to then writing the narrative history that sheds light on the Mountain Meadows Massacre, the railroad. That's just fascinating. That whole building of the railroad is fascinating. So having that kind of detail reminds me a little bit about I should say, the Mary Chestnut diary at the Civil War. You know, she was just an everyday person and wrote this fascinating diary that, when it was edited and published, won the Pulitzer Prize, I believe. And I think it's called Mary Chestnut's Civil War. It kind of reminds me of that, and just the kind of records that must be out there still. So, Barbara, you're also working on a volume that's coming out later in the year called Queer Joy. This is an anthology, I believe. And so just tell us a little bit about how Signature came to receive this manuscript and accept it for publication.
Yeah, so actually, before I was hired to be company director of Signature Books a little over a year ago, I follow someone on Twitter who is a lesbian former Latter-day Saint, post-Mormon. And so I follow her and kind of that whole community I've been following on social media, and I thought, there ought to be a book on this, a book of people's stories on this. And then so when I was hired to work for Signature, I said, again, there ought to be a book on this. And so I reached out to this particular person. Her name is Carrie Spencer Prey, and she is an author and an editor herself. And I just discussed this idea, and she said, I'd love to do it. I'd like to keep it focused on queer joy. So, in other words, not just the sad or tragic or horrific stories that happen, sadly, sometimes to our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, but on the queer individuals finding their joy. I said I thought that sounded like a fantastic idea, and we contracted with her, and so she's gone about gathering some really fantastic stories from people. I've been reading a few of them. They're really moving, really touching, and so that will be coming out soon. It's come in faster than we thought. She's been amazing, just very quickly gathering these stories and put together some fantastic anthologies and some fantastic essays. And people will recognize the names of a lot of these essayists that you probably know who they are because they're well known. I won't share their names yet, but you'll recognize these names and just be able to read their stories from where they're coming from. So I think it's a very important book. And I hope it kind of moves the needle for people and increases understanding and knowledge from these folks.
Yeah, it really should. And counting on that, I think it will. And yeah, hearing this side, like you mentioned, we hear the tragic side, some of the horror stories out there that people have had to endure, but also, the joy. And it will help people understand, as long as the result is we understand people better, we understand this community and know that they are brothers and sisters and friends, and understand, just creating greater understanding. If we can do that, that's the key.
Yeah, that's the goal.
Yeah, so we're publishing history, memoir, current events in this anthology. So we've got a great second half of the year coming up, and so for me, it got me excited about these all over again. And I've known about them, but just hearing you talk about them, I'm thinking, wow, I can't wait to read these. So hopefully, and I'm sure, I don't have any doubt, our readers and listeners will take note, and now their appetites are whetted a little bit and a little bit more. And so you know what you have to look forward to from Signature Books in 2023.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts from either one of you on the works we're doing, or just the state of the press at the moment?
Yeah, for our listeners, I think we should add that it's right now it's just us as editors and publishers talking about these forthcoming books. But I just want to reassure our listeners that as each of these books come out, we will have the authors themselves on to talk about their works themselves on this podcast. So I hope everybody looks forward to hearing from the authors themselves as well.
Yes, you can definitely count on that. John, anything from you? Or?
No, I'm excited. I think these books are important, and I hope people enjoy them. I think they will, and I'm looking forward to being able to see them all in print. It's weird. I've done this a long time, and I go through these in manuscript form, and then I go through them in page proof form. But there's still nothing quite like holding the finished book in your hand. It's exciting for us, and of course for our authors who have worked so hard. And I appreciate Barbara saying that they're going to be on here. They're really the ones doing the work. We're just fortunate enough to be able to work with them and get their work out into the world.
Yeah, and we'll have more questions for them. They can provide more answers in detail about the stuff, the things about the books that make them fascinating to us. So look forward to hearing from all of them. They'll certainly shed light on the books.
Yeah, and just adding to what John just said, Devery, if I may. Of course, the three of us, in our last podcast, we talked about how the three of us are authors ourselves. And so, like John said, there's nothing like working on a book forever. And I know we're all, well, Devery, you've held your own books in your hands, so you know that feeling better than anyone. But looking forward to that. But I think besides that, there's a joy in helping others achieve their goals, their dreams, in writing their own books and be able to publish their books for them is, for me at least, just as fulfilling as doing my own book. And so, like John said, with each new book that comes out that we've been working on, just holding it in our hands, I'm just as excited for our authors as I am for ourselves when we have our books come out.
Yeah. It's always exciting to hold them, and make sure you smell them too, because like new car smell, it doesn't last forever. So, and that's an exciting part. I love the smell of new books. I love the feel. And it suddenly makes it feel like it was all worth it. Just that brief moment that you first see it and hold it and smell it. It's like, wow, this made it worth it, if nothing else. But then the rest of the world gets to read it too. And so that adds to all of that in time. So, all right. Well, thanks so much for joining me today on this episode of the Signature Books podcast. And have a great rest of your day working and editing away.
Thank you, Devery.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.